The autumn wind swept through the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, Texas, carrying the scent of sage and the warning of another hard winter. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that came when people had already given up hope for the day. The wooden buildings stood tired and gray under the late afternoon sun, their cracked signs creaking in the wind like old bones. Mary Whitfield sat on the wooden steps outside Miller's General Store, her arm wrapped protectively around her 7-year-old daughter, Clara. The little girl's cheeks were pale, her small body trembling despite the worn shawl Mary had pulled tight around them both. Their shoes were scuffed, their clothes travel-stained, and their stomachs empty. They had been in Cedar Ridge for 3 days now. 3 long days of polite refusals, kind but firm no's, and empty promises of maybe next week. Mary had gone door to door, offering to wash clothes, cook, mend, anything for food and shelter, but times were cruel out here. Folks could barely feed their own. "Mama, I'm hungry," Clara whispered, her voice barely a breath. Mary's chest ached at the sound. "I know, sweetheart. We'll find something soon." She smoothed down the girl's tangled blonde hair, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "You be brave a little longer." From across the street came the heavy thud of boots on the boardwalk. A man stepped into the fading light, a tall, broad-shouldered rancher, hat pulled low, spurs jingling with each step. He walked like someone used to wide spaces and long silences. Ethan Cole. Mary didn't know his name yet, but she could tell what kind of man he was by the way he carried himself. Steady, sure, like the earth itself couldn't shake him. He'd come to town for supplies, same as always, but this time, something stopped him. A woman and a child sitting on the store steps, too proud to beg, too desperate to hide their need. He paused. "Ma'am," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat. Mary looked up, clutching Clara closer. "Sir?" Ethan studied them. The woman couldn't have been more than 25. Her dark hair was pinned neatly despite the dust, her chin held high, though her eyes showed exhaustion. The girl pressed against her side looked half-starved. "You new to Cedar Ridge?" he asked. "Yes, sir. We arrived Monday." "Looking for work?" "Yes. I'll do anything honest." Her voice was polite but firm. "I can sew, cook, clean. I'm not afraid of hard work." Ethan nodded slowly. "Work's hard to come by for a woman alone." Mary met his gaze, her pride warring with her fear. "I'm not looking for pity, mister." "Cole! Ethan Cole! I own the Double C Ranch, 5 miles north of here." She hesitated, waiting for what he'd say next. He took off his hat, running a rough hand through his dark hair. The words that came next were not ones he'd planned to speak aloud. "Your daughter needs a home," he said evenly, his gray eyes steady on hers. "And my bed needs a wife." Mary froze. Around them, a few townsfolk turned their heads, curiosity pricking like barbed wire. "Excuse me?" Her cheeks flushed with shock. Ethan's tone didn't change. "I'm not talking about impropriety, ma'am. I'm talking about marriage. I lost my wife 2 years ago to fever. I've got a ranch to run and a daughter to raise. Sarah's 9. She needs a woman's guidance, and I need a partner. A real wife, legal and proper." Mary's pulse pounded in her ears. "You're proposing marriage to a stranger?" "Folks do it all the time out here," Ethan said simply. "Mary's arrangements. The frontier is no place for courting and fine talk. It's about surviving." He looked down at Clara, whose eyes were wide and wondering. "You'd have a roof, food, safety, schooling for your girl. I'm not rich, but I'm honest." Clara tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, does the man have a house?" Ethan crouched down so he was eye level with her. "I do, little one, with a big fireplace that never goes out, and a kitchen big enough for 2 girls to bake cookies in." Mary's throat tightened. Her daughter's hope was like a knife twisting in her chest. "I need to think," she managed to say. "Fair enough." Ethan reached into his vest pocket and pressed a few coins into her palm before she could protest. "Get the girl a meal at Murphy's. I'll be here loading supplies another hour. If you're interested, I'll take you to see the ranch. You can decide after." Then he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Mary staring down at the coins glinting in her hand. That night, after their first warm meal in days, Mary found herself helping Clara climb into Ethan's wagon. The child's belly was full, her face flushed with happiness. "You don't have to decide anything today," Ethan said as he clicked the reins. "Just come see the place. Meet Sarah. See how it feels." The horses started forward, their hooves striking sparks off the hard-packed road. The prairie stretched before them in endless gold and amber. Mary sat silent, holding Clara close. She should have been frightened, but somehow she wasn't. This man, this rancher, didn't look at her the way other men did. There was no hunger in his eyes, only a quiet weariness and a strange kind of honesty. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why offer this to us?" Ethan kept his gaze on the trail. "Because I know what it's like to be alone," he said. "And because my Sarah needs someone to tell her when she's brushed her hair wrong. I can rope cattle, ma'am, but I can't braid to save my life." Despite herself, Mary smiled. "That's honest, at least." "I don't do much else, but honest." The sun dipped low as they rode, painting the world in firelight. And when they crested a small rise, Ethan pointed ahead. "There it is! The Double C!" Mary followed his gaze and felt her breath catch. A solid two-story house stood against the endless sky, smoke curling from the chimney. Fenced pastures spread wide, horses grazing in the distance. It wasn't grand, but it looked strong. Safe. Home. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the porch. The door burst open, and a girl ran out, her dark braids flying. She stopped short, staring at the strangers. "Papa, who are they?" Ethan smiled faintly. "These are our guests, Sarah, Mrs. Whitfield and her daughter, Clara." Sarah's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but curiosity quickly won. "Are you the new housekeeper Papa said he needed?" "Sarah," Ethan said gently but firmly. Mary blushed, lifting her chin. "Your father and I are talking about possibilities." "Come inside," Ethan said, lifting Clara down with surprising gentleness. "It's getting cold, and you could use a cup of coffee." Inside, the house was warm, sturdy, and clean, but bare. No flowers, no color, no laughter, just quiet strength. Ethan poured coffee, awkwardly offering milk to the girls. "You can stay the night if you like," he said finally. "No decisions yet. Tomorrow you can see the ranch in daylight." Mary looked around. The home, the child, the man who seemed both kind and guarded. For the first time in months, she felt something stir that she hadn't dared feel since her husband's death. Hope. The first light of dawn crept over the plains, turning the sky a soft gold and painting the Double C Ranch in quiet beauty. Mary stood by the small window of the guest room, the shawl tight around her shoulders, watching the land awaken. Cattle moved like dark shadows in the distance, their breath steaming in the chill. From the barn came the low murmur of men's voices and the rhythmic sound of a horse being saddled. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ethan Cole's face in the flickering firelight, calm, steady, and full of something she couldn't quite name. His offer still echoed in her mind. Marriage, a real home, safety. Yet it all seemed too sudden, too unreal. "Mama?" Clara whispered sleepily beside her, rubbing her eyes. "Can we stay?" Quote. Mary turned to her daughter, brushing a curl from her forehead. "We'll see, sweetheart. We'll see what kind of man Mr. Cole really is." By the time they came downstairs, the kitchen was filled with the smell of coffee and bacon. Ethan stood at the stove, his sleeves rolled up, moving with practiced efficiency. Sarah sat at the table, her braids swinging as she helped set out plates. "Morning," Ethan greeted, turning with a nod. "Hope you slept all right." "Very well, thank you," Mary said, though her voice was unsure. "Sit," he said simply. "There's plenty." Mary hesitated. She wasn't used to a man cooking, much less serving breakfast with quiet courtesy. When she finally sat, Clara's eyes widened at the plate of eggs and biscuits before her. "Eat up, little one," Ethan said kindly. "There's more where that came from." As they ate, the room filled with the girls. Chatter, Sarah talking about the horses, Clara listening like each word was gold. Mary watched the two children together, Sarah's tough curiosity softened around Clara's shy sweetness. The sight warmed her more than the coffee ever could. After breakfast, Ethan stood, taking his hat from the peg by the door. "I'm checking the herd in the south pasture," he said. "You're welcome to come, Mrs. Whitfield. See what life here's really like." Mary hesitated, then nodded. "All right, I'd like that." Sarah whooped. "Can Clara and I come too, Papa?" "Stay close to the house for now," Ethan said. "You can show her the kittens later." The morning sun was bright, but the air still held winter's bite as Ethan helped Mary into the wagon. They rode in silence for a while, the land stretching endless before them. Sagebrush and cottonwoods shimmered in the breeze. "This is beautiful country," Mary said softly. "It's harsh," Ethan replied, "but it's honest. Everything out here earns its place or it doesn't survive. Same with people." Mary looked down at her hands. "I'm trying to earn mine." He glanced at her then, his gray eyes softening. "You already have. You're still standing. That's more than most." They reached a rise overlooking the herd, hundreds of cattle moving like a living tide across the open plain. Ethan guided the horses to a stop, pride and fatigue etched equally into his face. "That's your herd?" Mary asked quietly. "Ours," Ethan corrected before he could stop himself. Then, clearing his throat, "I mean the ranch's herd." Mary smiled faintly, but said nothing. They spent the morning touring the land. He showed her the barns, the smokehouse, the corral. Everywhere, the signs of a man doing his best to hold things together with hard work and sheer will. "This place needs a woman's hand," Mary murmured without thinking. Ethan nodded. "So does my daughter." At midday, they returned to find Sarah and Clara sitting in the grass outside the barn, feeding bits of biscuit to a litter of orange kittens. The girls looked up, laughing together, sunlight catching in their hair. "They're getting along," Ethan said quietly. Mary's heart ached at the sight. "Clara hasn't laughed like that in months." "Then, I'd call that a good sign," he said. That afternoon, Mary found herself in the kitchen with Sarah, making stew for supper. She hadn't planned to, but it felt natural, almost right. The girl was eager to learn, and Mary found herself giving gentle instructions: how to cut the vegetables, how to stir without spilling. When Ethan walked in that evening, dusted with dirt and fatigue, he stopped in the doorway, staring. For a heartbeat, he said nothing. Just watched them, Sarah smiling proudly beside Mary, the table already set, the smell of food filling the house. "Smells good," he said finally, setting his hat down. "Didn't think I'd ever eat real stew again." "Sarah did most of it," Mary said, smiling at the girl. "I just stirred," Sarah said, though her chest puffed with pride. Over dinner, the talk was easy. The girls filled the silence with laughter. Even Ethan, usually quiet, found himself smiling more than he had in months. Afterward, while Sarah and Clara chased fireflies outside, Ethan poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Mary on the porch. "You've changed this house in a single day," he said softly. "I only made supper," she replied. He shook his head. "No, you made it feel like home." For a long moment they stood in silence, watching the sun fade behind the hills. The wind carried the soft sounds of the girls, laughter from the yard. Finally, Ethan spoke again. "I know I didn't ask properly before. I spoke plain, maybe too plain, in town, but I meant what I said. I need a partner, a wife, a mother for Sarah." Mary stared down at the coffee in her hands. "And what would you expect of me as your wife?" Ethan's voice was quiet, honest. "To help me keep this place running, to raise our girls together, to make this house a home again. As for the rest, that's between 2 people who decide to care for each other. I won't take what's not freely given." Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. He spoke without pretense, without flattery, but with something far rarer, respect. "And if I said no?" she asked. "Then I'd take you and your daughter back to town tomorrow," he said simply, "and make sure you had enough to get by for a while. But I'd hope you wouldn't say no." Mary looked out across the darkening land, where the last light of the sun kissed the horizon. For the first time in years, she didn't feel hunted or hopeless. She felt steady, safe. Inside, Clara's laughter rang through the walls, joined by Sarah's. Mary turned back to Ethan. "I'll stay tonight. Tomorrow, we'll see." He nodded, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That's all I ask." That night, as she tucked Clara into bed, the little girl whispered sleepily, "Mama, I like it here. It feels like home." Mary brushed a kiss across her forehead. "It does, doesn't it?" Quote. When she finally lay down, the wind rattled softly at the window, and the distant cry of coyotes echoed over the plains. But for the first time in a long time, Mary wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. The next morning dawned bright and cool, the kind of day when the sky stretched endless and blue over the Texas plains. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, mingling with the crackle of bacon on the stove. Mary moved easily through the room, almost forgetting this wasn't her home yet. She poured coffee, packed lunches for the girls, and only realized what she was doing when she looked up and found Ethan watching her from the doorway. "You're up early," he said, his voice warm but rough from sleep. "I couldn't rest," she admitted. "The house wakes with the sun." "That it does," he said, stepping inside. "I'm glad you're still here." Mary smiled faintly. "So am I." They ate breakfast in companionable silence. Sarah chattered about teaching Clara to ride, and Clara's eyes shone with excitement. Watching them, Mary's chest swelled with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. But peace didn't last long in the frontier. Near midday, the sound of hooves thundered up the drive. Ethan's easy expression hardened. He set his coffee down and stepped out onto the porch, hand hovering near his gun. Dust rose as 3 riders came into view. Hard men with cold eyes and faces sunburned by a life spent outside the law. Mary froze, the memory of Colorado flashing before her eyes. The lead rider, a lean man with a scar across his cheek, pulled his horse to a halt. "Afternoon," he said, voice oily smooth. "We're looking for a woman, Mary Whitfield. Heard she came this way." Ethan stood firm. "You heard wrong." The man's gaze shifted past him to the window where Mary stood, pale and shaking. "That her?" Ethan moved, blocking their view completely. "The lady you see is my wife," he said, his tone flat and final, "and you're trespassing on my land." The man's lip curled. Her husband owed money to a man in Colorado. "That debt don't disappear just 'cause she took up with a rancher." Ethan's hand rested casually on his rifle. "Her husband's debts died with him, and you're about 2 breaths away from regretting your visit." The man spat into the dirt. "We'll be back. You can't hide her forever." "Try it," Ethan said evenly, "and you'll find out just how far I'll go to protect what's mine." The men wheeled their horses and rode off in a cloud of dust, their laughter carried away by the wind. Inside, Mary's hands trembled as she set down the coffee cup. Ethan turned, his face still carved from stone. "You all right?" She nodded weakly. "Those were Morrison's men. I knew they'd find me sooner or later." Ethan stepped closer. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. You're safe here." She looked up at him, tears threatening. "You don't understand. They'll come back. They always do." "Then we'll be ready," he said. "But they won't be coming for a widow anymore. They'll be coming for Mrs. Ethan Cole." Mary blinked. "You're saying," quote. "I'm saying we marry tomorrow," Ethan said simply. "I'll talk to Reverend Mills tonight. Once the papers are signed, no man can touch you or Clara. You'll both be protected under my name." It wasn't a proposal made from passion or romance, but from something deeper: steadfastness, resolve. Mary hesitated only a moment. "All right," she whispered. "We'll marry." The wedding was small and quick, held in the little white church at the edge of Cedar Ridge. Reverend Mills spoke the words, and Ethan's deep voice answered every vow with unshakable certainty. Mary stood beside him in a borrowed blue dress, her hand trembling in his, until she looked into his gray eyes and saw not pity but respect. When the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," Ethan leaned forward and brushed his lips softly against hers. Not a claiming kiss, but a promise. Outside, the girls threw handfuls of wildflowers, giggling as the petals danced on the wind. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Cole?" Ethan asked. Mary smiled, the title warming her more than she'd expected, said softly, "Let's go home." Weeks passed. The gossip in town faded, replaced by new stories, new scandals. At the ranch, life settled into rhythm. Mary kept the house running, managed the books, taught the girls lessons in reading and sewing. Ethan worked from dawn till dusk, but came home to laughter instead of silence. They were a family now, in every way that mattered. Still, the shadow of Morrison's men lingered at the edge of thought until one bitter January night when the sound of gunfire shattered the peace. Ethan was up in an instant, rifle in hand. "Stay inside!" he barked, but Mary was already reaching for the revolver she kept by the pantry. Clara clung to Sarah's arm as they crouched behind the kitchen table. Through the window, Mary saw shapes moving near the barn. "They're trying to take the horses," she whispered. Ethan slipped out the back door, moving low through the snow. 2 gunshots cracked the night. Mary's heart hammered, but she didn't hesitate. She opened the window and fired once, her bullet striking the dirt at a man's feet. The rustlers scattered. Moments later, silence. Then Ethan's voice, "It's over." When he came back inside, his face was cold and calm, but his hands shook slightly as he set the rifle down. "Just a couple of Morrison's men. They won't be back." Mary's breath left her in a rush. "You could have been killed." "So could you," he countered gently, stepping closer. "But you didn't run. You stood your ground." He brushed a stray curl from her cheek. "You were brave tonight, Mary." She met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "I'm tired of being afraid," she said softly. "Then don't be. Not here. Not with me." That night, after the children were asleep, Mary found herself standing in the doorway of Ethan's room. He looked up from where he sat by the fire, surprise flickering in his eyes. "I couldn't sleep," she said quietly. "Neither could I," he admitted. She crossed the room, heart pounding. "You said once this would be a partnership, that we'd decide when to share more than just a roof." "I remember," he said. "And I meant it." Mary took a deep breath. "I've decided." Quote. Ethan stood slowly, his expression softening. "You're sure?" Quote. "Yes." Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. "I'm tired of surviving, Ethan. I want to live again." He stepped forward, his hands gentle as they came to rest against her shoulders. "Then live with me." When he kissed her, it was tender and patient, like the first thaw after a long winter. The kiss deepened, not rushed but certain, sealing the quiet love that had grown between them since that day on the dusty street. Outside, snow fell softly over the Double C Ranch, blanketing the earth in white. Inside, warmth bloomed. Months later, spring came with color and laughter. The ranch thrived, the girls grew tall and strong, and Mary's belly rounded with new life. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the wind carried the scent of wildflowers across the prairie, Ethan wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Hard to believe," he murmured. "All this started because I needed a housekeeper." Mary laughed softly. "That's not what you said." He smiled against her hair. "No, I suppose it isn't." Quote. She turned to face him, her eyes shining. "Do you regret it?" Quote. Ethan looked down at her, at the woman who'd brought warmth back to his home, laughter back to his daughter, and love back to his heart. "Not for a single day," he said. "You and Clara saved me as much as I saved you." Mary rested her head against his chest, the steady beat of his heart grounding her in the world she'd thought she'd lost. Sometimes love didn't come wrapped in poetry or grand gestures. Sometimes it came as a rancher's quiet promise, a warm fire, and a second chance on a dusty Texas morning. The wind rose, sweeping through the tall grass like a song. And as the stars began to shine over the Double C, Mary Cole knew she'd finally found what she'd been searching for all along. Home.